Good morning, everybody. Pastor Tony here. It is Wednesday, the 17th of March. Amazing, right? We're moving through March. This is one of my favorite times of year, right before Easter. I mean, the text this week, we're really getting into the heart of the gospel, the heart of the good news of what God has done for us in Jesus. Today is no different. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 5 through 10. We are in these short verses, but the Hebrews writer wants to remember he's speaking to a group of Christians, more than likely Jewish Christians, because of his use of the law and his use of the whole Jewish system of atonement, high priest talk, things like that. Moses, Jesus is a better Moses, all of those things in Hebrews. So we think that they're Jewish Christians, but we do know that they were under persecution, under a lot of stress and pressure because of their faith. But today, the Hebrew writer talks about Jesus being the great high priest, and that's where we're at. So verses 5 through 6, I'm going to read those first and then share a little bit. In the same way, Jesus did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. But God said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." The Hebrew writer wants us to know that Jesus is a high priest. The most perfect high priest, the best high priest that we could have. He uses two arguments from the psalm. The first one comes from Psalm chapter 2, verse 7, a familiar psalm that we know, where he says, "You are my son, today I have become your father." So he uses that as an argument that Jesus is a high priest that has been chosen by God. And then in the Psalm 110, verse 4, we're very familiar with the first three verses, but very rarely do we read the fourth verse. But the Hebrew writer, really one of the only New Testament writers that refers to Jesus as a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. But he uses this where he says, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Jesus, the Hebrew writer wants us to know, lacks the credentials of the Jewish faith to be a priest at all. It's not in his lineage. It's not in his family line. It's not in his credentials to be a high priest, but he is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And if you go forward, and I'm not going to spend much time there today, but you can go into Hebrews chapter 7, and he'll explain what he means by Jesus being a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek didn't have credentials, earthly credentials either, but he was chosen by God, and he was a high priest when Abraham walked the earth, or a priest in the order of Melchizedek when he walked the earth. So you can go read about Melchizedek, and the Hebrew writer later explains better about what that means. So the writer establishes right away in our text that Jesus has a divine appointment to be a high priest. But why is this important, right? Why is it important that Jesus be a high priest? Why a high priest? High priests were mediators between God and humanity. They stood between, and they offered sacrifice for atonement. The breaking of God's law required a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice that would atone for or cover. It would cover the sins of the people. And so high priests were the only ones that could go into the Holy of Holies, and they would offer sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins. So it's important, the Hebrew writer said, Jesus is a mediator now between God and humanity. Used to be a different type of high priest, but now Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek, not chosen by man, or not chosen, or he did not rise to that level on his own understanding. He did not take glory, right? He did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, which was a glorious position in the Hebrew faith, but he was chosen by God to be this. Verse 7, during the days of Jesus's life on earth, some translations say when Jesus was in the flesh, right? He offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. So Jesus is a high priest, but Jesus is also a sympathetic high priest. He is not a harsh priest. He is not judgmental. It is not that he does not understand. It's that he doesn't understand us. Those who need forgiveness, those who need to know that God loves them and forgives them, needs to be a sympathetic high priest, to stand as a mediator between God and those who need forgiveness. So Jesus, the Hebrew writer says, is a high priest, but he's also a compassionate, sympathetic high priest because he learned what it was like when he lived in the flesh. He learned what it was like to be human when he lived in the flesh. So Jesus' prayers, are seen to be tied to the passion. His passion of that he sacrificed and laid down his life for us. So God is the one who can save. So Jesus prays compassionately. He prays to his Father because his Father is the one who can save him from death. So the writer says his prayers were heard because of his piety or his reverence. Now, this is a strange passage because if you really look at it closer, you soon begin to realize God, who is the one to save him, right, doesn't. Jesus isn't saved. He dies. He suffers. He is beaten and bruised and spit upon, and people walk away from him and desert him, and all of this happens to Jesus. And yet the Hebrew writer says, during these days, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. But yet he didn't. Listen, being a righteous person doesn't mean that you won't suffer. Being a righteous person does not mean that we will not suffer. Jesus was righteous. Jesus was compassionate and pious and reverent. Jesus was the Son of God, the high priest sent by God, but yet he died. So God's actions to save come later, after the suffering. And this is important. The original readers of Hebrews are experiencing suffering, and their prayers seem to not be being heard. Faith is not simply God doing what you think he's going to do, but faith is trusting the one who will fully vindicate the faithful. But it may come after you die. That is the trusting long-term faith of Jesus. And that is resurrection. We know that now on this side of the resurrection. So verse 9 and 10, we'll close up here. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And this is the really strange image that we get. Every high priest that went into the presence of God made sacrifice with the blood of an animal, a lamb or some other animal that they were allowed to sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. But the Hebrew writer gives us this image of Jesus being the high priest and the sacrifice. Jesus goes before the Father as the mediator between man and God, humanity and God, but he also offers himself a perfect sacrifice. He is the one appointed by God to approach God and to be the gift offered for the cancellation of our sin. Jesus is the source of our salvation, and we can put our trust in him. We can follow him and love him, and and study him and be in relationship with him, therefore being in relationship with God, because Jesus is the mediator between us and the Father, and the perfect sacrifice that washes away all of our sin, atones for our sin, washes it away, cancels it, forgives us, and helps us live as we should. I hope this has been helpful to you. Hebrews is a great chapter, hard to understand sometimes because it does speak so much about the tied together, the old and the new. But it's a great, and especially this time of year, as we look to Jesus and his passion and his sacrifice on Good Friday and eventually his resurrection. God bless you guys. Have a great day.